Good afternoon. Welcome to the Daily Politics. It's the CBI conference today, and the business group says Britain is better off in the European Union. They think membership is worth £3,000 to every household. Nigel Farage will tell us why he disagrees. Police officers accused of misleading MPs over Plebgate will be hauled before Parliament and told to apologise or risk jail. We'll speak to the committee chairman. Ed Miliband says he would offer firms a 12-month tax break if they agree to pay the so-called living wage. So would that cut benefits or cut jobs?
I was offended when the Leader of the Opposition went outside in the front of Parliament and stood next to a sign that said, "Ditch the witch."
And which country has the most sexist parliament? All that in the next hour. With us for the first half of today's programme is Axelle LeMaire. She's the French MP for our very own constituency here in Northern Europe. It's a big constituency. Welcome to the programme. Now, these are tricky times for Axelle's fellow member of the French socialists, François Hollande. It's 18 months into his presidency, but last week he recorded the lowest opinion poll ratings of any French president on record, with just 26% of voters saying they approved of him. Axelle, that's quite an achievement. Why is he so unpopular?
I wish I'd known the answer.
Tell him, wouldn't you?
I would, of course. No, it's very paradoxical because the left in power has implemented reforms that hadn't been done in the past, and maybe that only us could do without having half of the country demonstrating in the streets. We're reducing the public deficit, we're changing school, we're reforming the labour market, bringing more flexibility, we're reforming the pension system, which is a tricky and difficult one, but still all those reforms are long-term ones and people don't see the results. What they see is their taxes going up and a president who has great capacities to compromise, but when it comes to commenting what's, making the headlines, maybe not so good at
But would you accept that he never even had a honeymoon period? It's not just that he's become unpopular since he's brought in his economic programme. He was unpopular almost from day two. But his popularity just died. So is it because his programme of tax rises that you mentioned just unpopular across the board? You have had protests. Farmers have protested and truck drivers over the eco tax, for example, and they want to see more of a balance with public expenditure being cut. You've got the wrong programme.
Well, we're discussing the finance bill at the moment, and when you look at the budget for 2014, 80% of the budget of the savings will come to cut in public expenses. It's only 20% coming to tax rises. So the public perception is clearly wrong. Also, people don't really make the difference between local taxes, which do not depend on national government, and national taxes. So it's last year it was the opposite. It was 2/3 of tax increases and 1/3 of expenses reduction.
Right.
But we're doing the opposite this time.
But people obviously don't like it. They don't like that balance, whichever way you're doing it, because forced to scrap proposed higher levies on popular individual savings products. You've had to do that because of protests, or certainly people are unhappy. A strike potentially by France's top football clubs protesting at the 75% tax levy on incomes of more than €1 million. That is a big problem for them.
But that's also interesting to see that. I think it's in the Financial Times today described as a U-turns, but we're in the process of parliamentary discussion over the budget. To me, as an MP, I see it as parliamentary democracy. We're just saying what we think is wrong, what should be improved, so it is a discussion, but in the end, in 2-3 weeks' time, the budget will be voted.
What about this idea of consensus? You said yourself that he's not going for the headlines, but he is described, François Hollande, as a man of indecision. U-turns are cited, fairly or unfairly, that he can't make a decision without speaking to everybody involved.
Which, personally, I think is very good, because he's a great listener.
But you look like a weak leader, don't you?
Well, look, but I think what he wants is a long-term project for the country. And when it comes to, again, reforming the labour market, it wasn't an easy task. But he spoke with all the unions, all of them, And they came up with a solution that was the first time in the last 30 years that an agreement could be reached. But then so people don't necessarily see that, but I assume that in the long term, the results will be positive.
What about,
I hope so.
Well, I'm sure you hope so, before the next election, of course. And looking at elections, what about the threat, as far as you're concerned, from the right, from the National Front, who seem to be gaining in support in some of the country's national by-elections? That's as a result of Hollande's policies, isn't it?
It is, well, this is a phenomenon that we see across Europe, I'm afraid. The rise of populist parties, of extremism. But it is particularly true in France, and especially at the next European elections, the National Front could be the first political party.
So what does François Hollande need to do?
Well, again, I think there are two answers. Keep telling the French people that those people are racist. What they're xenophobic. What they want is to have the migrants out of the country, and we think immigration is positive for the country when it is well controlled. And the other thing is have an economic and social agenda and prove that we can help increasing the living standards. We can help put growth back into the economy. You know, we're out of recession. For the last 2 months, I think, and the rise in unemployment is decreasing. So, of course, unemployment is not decreasing, but at least we're starting to see the first positive results of what we're trying to do.
And you think
that
might
will
turn
be
it
the
round?
answer.
Well,
Yes.
and I think most leaders would agree with that, isn't it? Economic growth will hopefully, they believe, bring them some sort of electoral support. What about his relationship with Angela Merkel? It is, as the Financial Times says, a bit of a one-woman show, isn't it? He is definitely the subservient partner of that relationship.
It's interesting to hear that because, again, that's really not the feeling that we get as parliamentarians in the French Assembly. And it's true of Mrs. Merkel and Mr. Hollande's relationship, but it's a very well-balanced relationship with all the different ministers. So, for example, the economy minister, he's on the phone every single day with the German, with his German counterpart, and we work together very well. So I think between what we read in the press and the reality of the negotiations, there's quite a difference.
All right, let's leave it there. Now, you won't have forgotten, if you're a regular viewer of the programme, and I hope you are, that Britain could be on the way to a referendum on our EU membership after the next election. Whether the relationship is good or bad for Britain is an issue that divides politicians, the public and businesses. Well, today, the largest business group, the CBI, is holding its annual conference, and it's decided that the country is better off inside the EU than out. The group says that the net benefit of EU membership to the UK could be more than £62 billion. That's £3,000 a year to every household, because membership has opened up trade with the EU and the rest of the world. A survey of CBI members found that 78% of businesses would vote to remain in the EU, and that's a view shared by small and medium-sized businesses. Director General John Cridland says British business is unequivocal. The single market is fundamental to our future. But industry isn't exactly full of starry-eyed Europhiles. And the CBI also says that if we do stay in, then reforms are urgently needed. This assessment has already been challenged, with UKIP leader Nigel Farage saying we don't need to be members of a political union in order to go on doing business. Well, joining us now from the CBI conference in London is Michael Rake, the president of the CBI and chairman of BT. Michael Rake, welcome to the programme. You were sharing a platform with the Prime Minister earlier. Is the CBI's view on EU membership now the same as David Cameron's?
Well, no, I mean, the view of our membership and the view based on the huge project we've carried out in the last 10 months in detail with the help of McKinsey, with interviewing people across Europe, businesses large and small, is it's overwhelmingly in our interest to remain in the European Union, a massive marketplace where we need to be engaged. And I think the Prime Minister was saying exactly the same thing this morning in his speech.
Have you accurately been able to gauge the level of Euroscepticism amongst your members?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Have you been able to accurately gauge the level of Euroscepticism amongst your members?
Right. Well, no, I think in the business community it's very clear, and as we said, we want to remain in the European Union, but we want reform. We want really to understand that we have to be competitive. It's a hugely important trade area with many bilateral trade agreements, including some extremely important ones coming up. So we understand the frustration of businesses, small and large, about unnecessary regulation. Whether it comes from Brussels or whether it comes from London, it's frustrating. And whilst we need regulation, it needs to be effective and it doesn't need to be burdensome, particularly when we have the beginnings of a recovery and we have to do everything we can to make sure this recovery is sustainable and we get real growth back into the economy, new jobs coming in, youth unemployment going down, and staying in a reformed European Union is critical to achieving that over the medium term.
Right, if it is critical, is it a mistake by David Cameron to offer the country a referendum?
Well, the question of whether or not there should be a referendum is a question for politicians.
Well,
we, the CBI, are very clear whether it's...
Is it just for politicians or isn't it for businesses? If you're saying it's critical, and John Cridland said that there's no credible alternative to being in the EU, then surely business has got to make plain, in political terms as well as economic terms, they have to stay in the EU.
I'm sorry, I can hardly hear you, but if I think you were asking... around alternatives. We've looked in the work that we did at alternatives, and I think the Norwegian example, the Swiss example wouldn't work. We'd be one or two removed. We'd have to pay the costs of compliance without any influence. And we don't think that's the way when we're trying to come out of a very long downturn to really ensure that we're creating the right conditions for investment and trade in the European Union and across the world. Those are the critical things that count. And in terms of our role at the CBI, whether it's a referendum on Scottish independence, whether it's a referendum eventually on the membership of the EU, our job is simply to get across the economic facts about these issues for the British people so that they can decide what the political elements are for them to decide on and to listen to their politicians. We in business must simply state what the implications might be, what the opportunities are, and what might happen in the event of a decision to leave the European Union.
Mike Rake, thank you very much. Sorry you couldn't hear it, but we could hear you loud and clear, which is always a bonus. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the conference. We're joined now by the UKIP leader, Nigel Farage, and Axelle LeMaire is still with us, of course. Well, that's a bit of a blow, isn't it? Because not only does he say that the majority of his members, businesses, whom you would like to get on board, back the idea of staying in the EU, but it's absolutely critical. It would be a huge mistake to leave.
Well, let's remember what the CBI is. It is big business, it is corporatism, it is effectively an arm of government, and most of the firms in the CBI love the EU. It's fantastic for them. They go to the Commission, they help the Commission draft rules, and those rules help stop small and medium-sized competitors from ever challenging them. And that's why,
well,
that's why
because
the
some
CBI...
of his members are small businesses. I mean, even in the sample that was done as part of their polling, all right, it was a smaller sample, you're right, of small and medium-sized businesses, but there was still a significant number, and 77 or 78%.
That was clever of the CBI.
Well, clever and true.
To throw a few small businesses in, knowing
more than a few.
Knowing that when Business for Britain polled 1,000 firms with a genuine spread of large, medium and small businesses, 2/3 of their members wanted a referendum and half of them said the costs of the single market outweigh any benefit. This CBI, these were the same people 12 years ago saying we should join the euro. They were wrong about that and they're wrong about this.
Right, but Nigel Farage, are you dismissing then the 240,000 business members of the CBI who do think it is better to stay within the EU? Does their voice not matter? Again,
what is interesting is even within the CBI, the cracks are beginning to show. There's a significant minority of CBI members who don't agree with the view that Mike Rake's just put. And I mean, Digby Jones, who was the CBI's Director General a few years ago, has now come to the view reform is impossible within this European Union, and the sooner we have a referendum on it, the better.
Right, let's pick up on the reform is impossible. Isn't it true, Axelle LeMaire, why would François Hollande, or Angela Merkel for that matter, want to do anything that would be beneficial to Britain in terms of regulation and reform or opt-outs for Britain, without the burden of having to pay for membership?
Because they believe that Europe is stronger with Britain in just as Britain is stronger as part of the European Union. It's this old debate sounds surreal to me. If I wanted to be cynical, I would say, oh, please leave. This will help the French businesses because you're one of our main competitors. So if you're out, you're just out of the picture.
Actually, we're your biggest export market. And this is the point that gets forgotten, that the British market is absolutely crucial for France and for Germany. We're now the biggest export market in the world for those two countries, and we will go on doing business regardless whether we're in a political union or not.
But that's an argument for reform, isn't it? Which is exactly what David Cameron is saying. If, as you say, we are so important from a trade point of view, that's the leverage, isn't it, for reform?
It could be, but the only way a negotiation would work is you walk into the room carrying a great big stick, and you say, give me X, Y and Z, or we're leaving. The Prime Minister's problem is, he is saying, give me X, Y and Z, and if you don't give it to me, we'll have a referendum in which I will endorse Britain's continued membership. He's going into this with a very weak hand.
I mean, the CBI, though, in a way, has tackled your argument about the benefits of coming out. So remaining a trading partner but not being part of the political union, because they have said they've looked at all those trading alternatives. They've looked at Norway, they've looked at Switzerland, and actually the benefits of leaving just aren't that great. We would have no influence and we would have the costs.
I've listened all day to the CBI spokesman on this, and they talked about the rest of the world and the Swiss model. Switzerland has got more trade deals with other parts of the world than we do as members of the European Union.
It took 9 years, apparently, for Switzerland to renegotiate partial access to the single market. 9 years is a very long time.
Switzerland are rich. Switzerland have got more trade deals globally than we've got. And the Swiss have recognised that Europe is not the economic future of the world. It's, in fact, going to become the backwater. We've got to be global, not just European.
What do you say to that, Axelle LeMaire?
Well, on reform, what I hear here in this country is that we need to tackle the red tape, put down obstacles to freedom of trade. And yes, we completely agree, but the red tape, most of the time, it comes from national legislations. For example, at the last EU summit, the heads of state, including David Cameron, said that they wanted e-commerce to be more developed. What is the problem with e-commerce at the moment? It's that we have 28 different states applying their own regulations.
Well,
so actually Europe is good in the sense that it brings
that argument
agreements.
Was used for employment legislation, it was used for environmental legislation, and the reality is we finished up with thousands of new laws coming over the course of the last few years. Some governments interpret them rather more fully and rather more wholly than others, but the fact is the source of the legislation is Brussels.
Right. Do you disagree, though? And I mean, can you don't have to point this evidence in this particular interview, but can you actually point to the fact that £62 billion in net benefit from EU membership, they're very confident of that figure?
I've never heard such rubbish in all my life.
Is it rubbish? You can't say that the CBI, who are very respected business people...
No, they're not. They are discredited because they wanted us to join the euro. And are they actually saying that if we weren't governed by Herman Van Rompuy and Mr Barroso, that Champagne would refuse to sell its produce in London? It is utter nonsense. And I could show you a study.
Except that you'd have tariffs, wouldn't you, Nigel Farage? You would have... If you had to go it alone...
on your biggest export market in the world.
You can't guarantee that there wouldn't be tariffs on 90% of exports to the EU.
If Monsieur Hollande wants French unemployment to rocket, he can consider tariffs. You know, the German car industry is very, very powerful in terms of lobbying within that country. They wouldn't allow Angela Merkel to even contemplate tariffs.
Do you think that's true? Or would Britain face those tariffs?
I think you're missing the point. Our priority at the moment is to be in a strong position enough to negotiate a good transatlantic partnership with the United States. And we're very conscious that we wouldn't be able to do that as France as a single country. It's
Would you put tariffs on us?
It's Europe with its 500 million customers in one single market in face of the US that can negotiate in a proper position.
Switzerland's done that with China. Iceland's done a free trade deal with China, and they've got 300,000 people. Big is not better.
The question about tariffs is interesting. Would you want François Hollande to put tariffs on British exports to the EU if, let's say, Britain went it alone?
No, but clearly the rules of the game would change. So it would depend on the particular situations, on the type of goods. It was so
You're right. The rules would change.
Reopen the book of negotiations.
We could scrap a whole load of employment regulations put on small industry. We could look at environmental legislation more sensibly and make ourselves more competitive.
But what companies need is stability. You would just reopen the whole book of negotiations and rules and people.
Is stability
it would bring so much uncertainty.
Doing the French car industry much good? You know, when production's fallen by 50% in the last 4 years. Is stability being stuck in a currency that is 20% overvalued for France now? If that's stability, I don't want it.
Well, if we're still the 5th biggest power, you're the 6th, I think.
And on that, oh dear, she might have just...
Well, they always do, don't they?
Listen, Nigel Farage, thank you very much. Now, officers accused of giving misleading accounts of a meeting with former Chief Whip Andrew Mitchell are facing an investigation by the police watchdog. And they'll also be called back before the Home Affairs Select Committee after being accused of giving misleading answers to MPs last month. The committee wants them to apologise for misleading it. David Davis is a friend of Andrew Mitchell's. Yesterday, he gave his reaction.
This is the fiercest report I've seen in 25 years, and I've been a Select Committee chair myself for 5 of those years. It hinges on the not telling of the truth. You know, the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth is central to our judicial system and therefore is the core of policing. And on 2 occasions, these police officers have now plainly not told the truth. So that's why they've been recalled, which is unusual, to say the least. And that's why I think the IPCC has taken over the inquiry, has said the inquiry was fine, but the conclusions were all wrong, and we're going to rejudge them.
Tory MP David Davis. Well, I'm joined now by the chairman of the Home Affairs Select Committee, Keith Vaz. Welcome to the programme. Keith Vaz, you believe these police officers lied to you in your committee?
It's important that they come before the committee and explain why the evidence that they gave to us was different from our subsequent information that they sent to us. And clearly to us, this was misleading. So here is their opportunity to put the record straight. In terms of the first officer, that's Sergeant Jones, he did not disclose the fact that he had 13 previous allegations of misconduct. And in respect of DC Hinton, when specifically asked about a reference to Theresa May, he said that the transcript contained typographical error. So what that affected, of course, was the credibility of the answers they gave us, and therefore, in effect, it might affect the credibility of what they've said previously. Right,
so we're talking about their credibility. You're not expecting them then to radically change what they said with regard to the meeting that they had with Andrew Mitchell?
Well, we'll have to see what they say. Of course, they're at liberty to say to the committee anything that they want to about what happened at that meeting. But as you know, we recommended specifically that there should be a case to answer for misconduct. The IPCC has worked with great speed to make sure that there is going to be a hearing, and I'm pleased to tell you that we have just called in the IPCC tomorrow, so the chair and the officer, the senior officer, the vice chair who will be dealing with this inquiry, will also be coming before us tomorrow afternoon. Right. So we'll hear from these officers. We'll then hear from the IPCC, because, of course, when they came before us, Joe, they said, we can't look at this again. They then looked at our report and decided they could look at it again. We want to know why. Do
you think we're going to get to the bottom of this, Keith Vaz? I mean, after all these Select Committee hearings, the Independent Police Complaints Commission now saying that they will look at this particular case. We still haven't had a response, of course, from the CPS over the actual altercation and incident itself. To the layman, it must seem ridiculous in terms of the time and the resources that have gone into this.
Absolutely. When the police can conduct a murder investigation very, very quickly. I mean, one of the forces was the West Midlands Police, who very recently investigated a person who was trying to blow up some mosques in the West Midlands. They did this in record time. The person pleaded guilty and he's gone to jail. Right. This relates to a 45-minute meeting in Sutton Coldfield over a year ago and a 30-second event that occurred in Downing Street. So it's now up to about £250,000 and hundreds of police officers have been involved. Yes, I hope we will have closure. As far as the Select Committee is concerned, we have a degree of closure. We felt it was important that this should be done independently, and now the IPCC will be conducting this investigation.
What will happen if the officers don't take up your kind offer of apologising or saying that they did mislead the committee?
Then we will refer them to the House for contempt proceedings, and that has got a particular approach, and that's got a particular procedure. They will then be asked to go before the House, and the House will take a view on it. So it will go out of the hands of the Select Committee and into the hands of the House itself, which has happened only very rarely.
Yes.
So I hope they will take the opportunity of putting the record straight tomorrow.
Because of this threat, I mean, legitimate threat that they could be in contempt. Could they actually go to jail?
Well, I think that is going down the line. I think it's for others to decide, and I don't want to be in a position, as we are going to be hearing evidence from them, to tell them where it's all going to end up. But I just hope very much this is a big opportunity for them to come before the committee, to explain why we were misled, to put the record straight and to effect closure.
But that is the ultimate sanction, isn't it? It is actually within the remit, isn't it? Just so that we're clear.
At the end of the process, yes, that is the case, but this will not happen tomorrow.
No.
This will be an opportunity for them to put the record straight, and the Select Committee hopes very much that that will happen.
Watching this, I'm sure you have vaguely been aware of the whole Plebgate saga. What's your view, Axelle?
Well, I can't comment on the specifics of the case, but I'm impressed by the roles played by the Select Committee. This one in particular, but Select Committees here in this country in general, they are a real counterpower to the executive and with real powers of inquiry. So I think that is a kind of model for the rest of the world in the way the parliamentary system works.
Well, we're going to be doing more on select committees towards the end of the programme. Keith Vaz, thank you. Modern, progressive, equal, not necessarily the first words that spring to mind when you think of the UK Parliament, which is no stranger to controversy over the treatment of female members. Well, it seems we're not the only ones with problems over sexism. Take a look at this.
Une chance pour la France.
The National Assembly in France earlier this month. A French MP is making a speech. You can't really hear on this recording, but a male MP is making clucking noises.
Je suis pas une poule, hein? C'est bon.
Don't call me a chicken, says Véronique Massenot. In France, it means airhead. Now let's go to the Dáil in Ireland, where they're about to vote on a motion about abortion. Watch what happens next. And cue #Lapgate. Talking of hashtags, a speech by the then Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard went viral when she got fed up of sexist remarks.
I was offended when the Leader of the Opposition went outside in the front of Parliament and stood next to a sign that said, "Ditch the witch." I was offended when the Leader of the Opposition stood next to a sign that described me as a man's bitch. I was offended by those things. Misogyny, sexism, every day from this Leader of the Opposition.
That went well. Her tormentor, the opposition leader Tony Abbott, now runs the country.
Well, I'm now joined by the Conservative MP Harriet Baldwin, and Labour's Fiona McTaggart. Axelle LeMaire, of course, is still here. What did you think of that excerpt, fairly famously played around the world, of Julia Gillard there in the Australian Parliament?
I'm in full empathy. And I was also sitting in the National Assembly when this incident happened to my female colleague, who was considered as a chicken.
With the clucking going.
With the clucking going on. But I think if you ask any female MP, at least in France, I don't know in other countries, she will have a personal story to tell. I can give you mine. I've got plenty, but one of them is I was asking my colleagues to push for the opening of a nursery in Parliament, because it's a big business. We are 3,000 people working there. There's not one single place for the children. And they said, "Oh, Axelle, you know, you're tiring with your nursery story. Why don't you go and breastfeed your children?"
Yeah. Ladies, what do you think of that?
Well, I would say that our parliaments are supposed to represent the real world. I think we would be naive to think that sexism doesn't exist in the real world still, but certainly as a workplace, and I speak as someone who was a pension fund manager, worked on a city dealing room floor, I would say that parliament's a lot more civilised than some other work environments.
What did you say? How do you respond to that sort of thing, Axelle?
Well,
do you ignore it or do you respond?
No, but we do represent the people, as you said, so we have to set an example. And I think it also, we have to do it through the number of women sitting in Parliament. In France, we're at 26%, which is 1 in 4. Not equal, but not as bad as here. I think it's 22.
No, it's not as bad as here.
22% of women, but at least we have an equal government. 18 women are ministers in France, and there's a clear conscience that things still need to be improved.
And in Britain, that's part of the problem, unfortunately. Yes, we have sexism in Parliament. Angela Eagle was told to calm down, dear, by the Prime Minister, a phrase that would never have been used to a man.
Although he, of course, always claims that wasn't... He was doing it from the advert, of course, and not as...
Indeed. But I think, you know, anyone can judge. And you're right, it is an issue of representation. It's slightly shocking that of the women in Parliament here, although Labour is in the opposition, more than half of the women in Parliament are Labour. We've only got 4 women in the Cabinet. We've got something like 42% in the shadow cabinet. We need to get the voices of women in leadership positions if we're going to deal with this issue.
Harriet?
Well, our party, of course, had a woman Prime Minister, and she was Prime Minister for 11 years and regarded as one of the greatest Prime Ministers the country's ever had. But I do agree that in terms of the atmosphere in Parliament, you know, you can't go into politics unless you can prepare to put up with some of the insults that will come your way, and they go in the direction of men as well as women. So I don't think we should feel, you know, particularly as though we're being picked on.
No, but in terms of how you improve, Axelle LeMaire has said you need to do it through representation. I mean, do you agree with that? And do you think there should be a commitment to having a certain number of female ministers? Do you think that should be enshrined in law? Or do you think what should be enshrined in law is having 50% of your candidates being female? Should there be any legal obligation to improve those figures?
Well, of course, in law, politicians are already exempt from Sex Discrimination Act, so you can positively discriminate in favour of women. And I certainly think we should all aspire to see half of our Parliament be female. It just goes without saying that half of the talented
Is aspiration enough,
will
though,
be female.
Harriet?
Tends to be, I think, a fairly slow way to change things, but I'm strongly against all women shortlists because I think that I would like to say that I'm here on my merit rather than because I was
here on my merit and I was selected from an all-women shortlist, Harriet. All-women shortlist is the way that has transformed Parliament. And transforming Parliament by getting more women into it changes what we do. I remember speaking to the clerk of the Defence Select Committee who said that before we had any women on the Defence Select Committee, which there had never been since until 1997, we never talked about the families that the men who fight leave behind. And now we do. And actually, it's making your families feel safe that makes you brave, rather than just talking about the size of the bombs and the bullets that you use.
So there is a cultural shift, obviously, from having women there in a different tone of conversation. But if, as it is enshrined in law in France to improve representation, or certainly of ministers within government, but you still get those incidents, don't you, in Parliament, of plucking, of people being rude to you. Does it... In a way, that in itself doesn't change, does it, sexism, if it exists amongst some of the men that are there in Parliament? And as Harriet said, it's just something you have to put up with.
No, but in the long term, it creates an environment, and men who use that kind of behaviour will be seen as violating, you know, doing gender discrimination. So I think when you look at the number of Tory candidates selected so far, out of 51, only 15 are women. So my view is that if we don't have proactive policies in place, things will take another 200 years to change. So actually, we will be examining a piece of legislation in January in Paris, increasing the level of fines on political parties if they don't respect the law on putting an equal number of candidates in elections.
Well, I think you can't put a law on women wanting to come forward and be politicians. So apparently about a third of the people who put their names forward in the Conservative Party are women, and about a third of them get selected proportionately.
So there's no seats, of course.
So there's no evidence to suggest that it's disproportionate to the number of people who want and aspire to become MPs. But
isn't one of the reasons why fewer women aspire because they see what happens to women in politics? And one of the things that us women politicians, have an absolute responsibility to do is to end this macho environment in which women work, which puts off young women from wanting to stand, from wanting to lead our Parliament.
I mean, Caroline Flint, who was the Labour minister at the time, complained of being treated as if she was window dressing, as she said.
Well, exactly, it does happen. And we need to shift the culture in our parties, and we also need to shift the behaviour in Parliament so that someone as strong as Julia Gillard never has to go through the horrible experiences that she endured before she made that brilliant speech.
All right, Fiona McTaggart, Harriet Baldwin, thank you very much. And thank you, Axelle LeMaire, for being our guest of the day.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, for a look at the week ahead. And the cost of high-speed rail too comes under scrutiny tomorrow by Parliament's Treasury Select Committee, with evidence heard from economists and infrastructure experts. Later in the day, MPs on the Defence Committee will hear from the Secretary of State, Philip Hammond, on Future Army 2020, the strategic plan for the UK's armed forces. Wednesday is Prime Minister's Questions. Will energy prices return as the issue of the day? It's certainly a subject which has dominated in recent weeks. There'll be no PMQs next week because Parliament's in recess. On Thursday, the heads of the 3 UK intelligence agencies will appear before the Intelligence and Security Committee in Parliament. This will be the first time the 3 men have appeared in public to talk about their work. And the European Union referendum bill reaches its report stage in the Commons on Friday. This, you'll remember, is the private members' bill launched by Conservative MP James Wharton. And we're joined from College Green by Kevin Schofield from The Sun and The Guardian's Rowena Mason. Welcome, both of you, to the programme on College Green. Let me start with you, Rowena. On HS2, David Cameron is trying to make a clear dividing line from Labour, saying that the party will be seen, Labour that is, as betraying the North if it withdraws support from HS2. Is this a clever tactic?
Yes, well, today he set out plans in a speech at the CBI to ask Sir David Higgins, who's the new chairman of HS2, to cut costs on the £42 billion project. And it comes after Labour has turned the screws, really, on the Tory party over HS2. It's said that it won't give the project a blank cheque. And it looks slightly reactive now that David Cameron is saying that he wants to look at how to cut costs.
Does it look, though, politically opportunistic, or did it, Kevin, when Labour said they wouldn't sign a blank cheque and looked to be saying they were going to pull support because that money could be spent better elsewhere?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's very tempting, I think, for Ed Balls. You know, it's 42 billion or even larger if you believe some estimates, which is a lot of money. So for a party which is still struggling to sort of shake off its spendthrift tag, if it was to say to the public at the next election, well, you know what, we're not going to spend all this money, we're going to spend that in other things like maybe house building, or maybe to even bring down the national deficit, I think it must be very tempting, and that's why Ed Balls is thrown out a few feelers there and giving very, very broad hints that he's thinking about pulling Labour's support for it. But I think there is tension, certainly, between him and his boss, Ed Miliband, over whether or not Labour will ultimately support HS2.
Well, so what's your prediction, Rowena? Will Labour support it, do you think, all the way through?
Yeah, I think when push comes to shove, I think they probably will. Ed Miliband has got to maybe flex his muscles a little bit on this one. I think if it was left to Ed Balls, as I believe Ed will ultimately have the final say, I think he would really want to cancel it, but I think he's going to come under a lot of pressure from his boss not to. I think it's going to be a tight one, but I think when push comes to shove, Labour probably will just support it, but with extreme caveats.
All right, well, let's turn our attention to Falkirk and allegations of vote fixing. I mean, Rowena, there's now the twist in the story that one of the complainants apparently didn't withdraw evidence as first claimed, and which was used by Labour in its internal inquiry for dropping it because of a lack of evidence. What do you make of it all?
Well, it's still very confusing. There's lots of claims and counterclaims, and we haven't really had a full explanation from the people in the middle of the story who originally complained about exactly what's gone on. An interesting twist this morning is that Joanne Lamont, the Scottish Labour leader, seemed to open the door to possibly Labour reinvestigating the allegations, and so that could increase pressure on Ed Miliband to speak out about it this week.
Do you think, Kevin, that he's going to have to reopen the investigation, Ed Miliband?
I'm not sure if he'll reopen the investigation. I think he has to publish the report, the internal report from their first investigation. Tom Harris, the former Labour Transport Minister, said last night that basically they have no option, really. It's still starting to look a little bit shady. I think if Labour, I mean, they're probably right insofar as the Labour Party rules are concerned that they don't normally publish internal reports. However, given the ongoing controversy around this issue, I think basically, I mean, it does look like they've got something to hide, unless he does choose to publish it. It's starting to reflect quite badly on the whole Labour leadership, I think.
Thank you both very much. Well, I've been joined by Labour's Anne Begg, Malcolm Bruce from the Liberal Democrats, and the Conservative MP Anne McIntosh for the rest of the programme. Welcome to all of you. As we've been hearing, the saga around the Labour selection in Falkirk has once again raised its head. Yesterday's Sunday Times included extracts of the internal Labour report into Falkirk, which have never been published by the party, in which Labour officials said there were deliberate attempts to frustrate interviews with some of the key witnesses. On the Sunday Politics, Len McCluskey, who is the General Secretary of Unite, the trade union at the centre of the controversy, gave his reaction.
The truth of the matter is this is a trap being laid by Tory Central Office.
Tory Central Office?
Of course it is. They're the ones that are making all the demands. And, of course, the media, the Daily Mail, the Sunday Times, you're telling me they're not the Conservative mouthpiece in the media? They're laying traps from Ed Miliband, and Ed Miliband should not fall into those traps.
Well, that was Len McCluskey from Unite. Anne Begg, is this just a conspiracy of what Len McCluskey calls the Tory press, and Ed Miliband is falling into their trap?
Well, I don't think the Tory press have helped, but I think this is a problem of our own making, and it's certainly not our finest hour. But having said that, I still think it's very much a matter for the Labour Party. It is an internal inquiry, and it's for the Labour Party to get to the bottom of this, to make sure that whatever happened in Falkirk doesn't happen again.
Should they publish that internal report?
Well, I don't think there's no precedent for publishing internal reports.
Stop them publishing it, particularly when there is so much row and controversy surrounding this particular case.
Well, there was a huge row about Bill Walker, the SNP MSP, who had to stand down because he was found in the courts as a wife beater. But there was no call at that time for the SNP to publish their internal report.
Would you like to see the internal report? Would it actually help, if you like, lay this to rest?
Well, that's what I don't know, because I'm not party to this. In fact, most people aren't, and indeed a lot of this, the speculation in the newspapers, aren't party to the actual facts of the case. But I think it is an issue for the Labour Party. It's obviously something they're going to have to look at and continue to look at, both to make sure that this is laid to rest, but also we need to put this behind us and get on and get a good candidate selected so the people of Falkirk are not let down.
In your view, has Unite abused its power in Falkirk?
I think they did things which were certainly over the line in terms of what they were allowed to do or able to do.
In terms of what? In terms of pressurising people to vote in a certain way?
No, because they're actually, interestingly enough, the unions have lost quite a lot of their power with regard to constituency party selections, because it's now one member, one vote. So the days of the mandated delegate has long gone. But it is about signing up. We want lots of people to join the Labour Party, but they should know that they've joined the Labour Party. It should be a conscious decision by them. And it's in those circumstances that I think that Unite overstepped the mark.
Right, because they are using bullying and intimidatory tactics as well?
Well, there were criminal activity as well. I mean, there was coercion and fraud and vote rigging, and any selection
except they were cleared, of course, of
we don't
wrongdoing.
know, obviously, from the outside. We don't know exactly what activities took place, but if someone was saying that they wished to make a witness statement and they weren't heard, then clearly that amounts to corruption and fraud.
But that's a matter for the police, and it has been referred to the police, and I think the emails, from my understanding, is the Labour Party hadn't, certainly at the weekend, seen the emails that Ineos had published. Those have all been handed over to police. So if there's corruption, if there's wrongdoing, there's illegality, then that's a matter for the police. If it's about internal party procedures, then that's a matter for the party to sort out themselves.
Should the investigation be reopened now?
Again, I'm not party to all the things.
But would you like to see the Labour Party investigation? Because it was dropped on the basis that people at the centre of this case withdrew withdrew their evidence, that witnesses withdrew their evidence. Now, should it be reopened?
I want the party to get to the bottom of exactly what it was that happened. Whether that should be a public or published is a different matter. But obviously, I think it's an issue for the party, and they must get to the bottom of it, because it's only by doing that will they make sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen again.
Will that be enough, Malcolm Bruce?
Well, first of all, I think it's a problem for the Labour Party in terms of its public perception. Any political party that looks as if it's a partly or wholly owned subsidiary of another organisation, like the trade union movement, has got a problem. The trade unions are perfectly legitimate, but if they're trying to select candidates, first of all, the implication is selecting a candidate gets you an MP. It's treating the voters with a degree of contempt. And I think what Labour have got to address is if they want to be a national party, they've got to demonstrate their priority is to the voters and to open, fair and democratic selection procedures and voting procedures. If the public think that the unions are buying Labour's influence, and the public, many of them do think that, this kind of case reinforces that belief.
Let me let you respond to that before we move on.
I think if that was true, then Malcolm's right. But I think, as I said, the unions, in regard to the individual selection of candidates, have much less power than they've ever had at any time in history, and that's partly because of one member, one vote, and that's why they've actually resorted to this tactic of trying to get more members who they think will vote that way. But actually, Labour Party members are very good at making up their own mind, and they can be quite contrary at times, and if they think they're being forced into taking an action, they'll vote
been
against
a gift to the Conservative Party and the coalition government, because the perception is that the unions are up to their old dirty tricks again.
Although the unions will say it's the fault of the Tory press, of course, who are making it up as he would see it. No, right.
Well,
the press pick up a story. I don't think you can blame them
Pardon?
The Tory press were not to blame for the dispute at INEOS.
No, well, that, of course, is...
But you're seeing a dispute on the 1970s style, both by management and Labour, which people thought had put behind us. So you put the two together, and people see it's the bad old game that we've seen before.
But I still think this is really something that hasn't been Labour's finest hour. Absolutely right. It's shown us up in a bad light. That's why we have to get to the bottom of it, make sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen again.
Moving on just very briefly, because we're running short of time, on Plebgate. Are you happy that the two officers are coming back before the Select Committee?
Yes, I'm also happy that the Independent Police Commission is looking into allegations of misleading both potentially a House of Commons Select Committee and also the public on a number of issues. I think the whole incident is highly regrettable, and the sooner we can put this to bed, the better, both for the British public and for Andrew Mitchell himself, for his own police authority at the time to question his integrity.
Would you like to see him back in government?
Yes, I'd certainly like to see him back in a very senior position.
Right. How does it make the police look?
Well, my committee was shadowing, if you like, or monitoring Andrew Mitchell, so I got to know him pretty well. And I thought the whole thing was very suspicious right from the start. He'd been a cabinet minister for 2 years, and suddenly he's challenged at the gate in a rather surprising way. And then a whole embroidery of stories came out. And what appears to be the case is that these were, first of all, manufactured and then lied about. So if that is the case, clearly we have to get to the bottom of it. And obviously the Select Committee is determined to do so. That's presumably why they've called the police back. Most police do a fantastic job, but it doesn't help the police reputation if they're seen to be conspiring.
And as one of my colleagues said, that not everybody has the resources available to Andrew Mitchell, who is a member of Parliament and can call on the goodwill of many.
That's what many people said. Right, let's leave it there. Ed Miliband has confirmed that a future Labour government would offer businesses tax breaks if they pay the living wage. That's the benchmark based on the amount an individual needs to earn to cover the basic costs of living. Private firms would be able to claim back about a third of the cost of raising their staff members' wages to the living wage. But not all Labour supporters are fans of the plans. Well, we're joined now by John McTernan, who was Tony Blair's political secretary. John McTernan, why isn't it a good idea that people are paid the living wage?
The national minimum wage, which the Labour government introduced, was subject to, at the time and since then, intense economic scrutiny to make sure you set the level at a level that doesn't destroy jobs. The London living wage, unveiled today by the Mayor of London, is £8.80 an hour, which is a 40% increase or more on the national minimum wage. I don't think you can increase wages that much without destroying jobs, and there's a study by the Resolution Foundation and the IPPR who say that if you implemented it across the country, it would actually lead to 300,000 young people losing their jobs, and I don't think we can afford that at
Now,
a time of high unemployment.
Is that because you don't want to take the leap all in one go? Is it something you would say politicians should aspire to that level of living wage over time?
I think the minimum wage has been allowed by the coalition to fall in value, and it should be increased. I think there's no doubt there's a case for that. But the living wage is a campaign which, on the one hand, we're told by the campaigners it's wrong to pay people at that level. And at the other hand, when you say it'll cause some businesses to have to sack people, they go, oh, look, we'll do it on a case-by-case basis. Either the living wage is the right thing to do, it should be all companies, or it's the wrong thing to do because it destroys too many jobs. And what I don't like about the living wage is that we're going to have a kind of a mix and match scheme is being proposed for this. I think Gordon Brown and the Tory governments before him got this right. Some people have low wages and they should be topped up by the government through tax credits or through family credit or through, as Ian Duncan Smith proposes, through universal credit. That's the right way to reward people in low-paid work rather than force some of them to become unemployed.
All right, John McTernan, thank you very much for joining us. Well, Anne McIntosh, do you agree with that? Is it better that some people just stay and accept those lower wages and that the state, funded by the taxpayer, subsidises that low pay with benefits?
Well, what we've already done as a coalition is taken 25 million people out of tax, so they don't pay tax till £10,000. So you can earn up to £10,000 from April next year before you pay tax. That is a very positive...
Would you rather not have the living wage and continue to top up with benefits?
Well, I don't think it accounts for a large number of women coming back to work, having a young family who wish to work part-time. I'm not quite sure how the living wage would apply to them. My real fear that John has touched on, I've already heard employers nationally on television saying that they are looking now not to lose people, but not to replace people when they leave their work.
Hasn't that been the economic reality, that the low wages part-timers it's been better than losing your job altogether? And if John McTernan is right and he uses those figures, there'll be 300,000 jobs lost if the living wage was imposed.
Exactly the same argument was used with the introduction of the minimum wage, and it didn't come to pass. But I think Anne has missed the point that the government is paying out to supplement the incomes of these people. Anybody who's on paying tax is not in the group we're talking about. So people get paid less by their employer, and that's been happening over years. They get it topped up by the state. That's why the welfare bill has gone through the roof.
But what if the business cannot afford to carry the level?
At the moment, the people who are carrying it are the British taxpayer, and it's the cost of supplementing the benefits to this group of people. And it's not just working tax credits we're talking about, it's also housing benefit, it's also...
You didn't introduce it.
Yes, and I want to ask you... But in fact, it's why on earth should the government be having to supplement people who are on
to Liberal Democrats. Surely Liberal Democrats say the onus should be on the employer, or more of it should be on the employer, so the state doesn't have to keep paying.
I think it's interesting that Anne Begg says, why should the government be doing it? It was the Labour government
who
introduced
under Gordon
this idea.
Brown, obviously, was into big redistribution. What about the Liberal Democrats?
Well, we're in favour of the living wage as an aspiration and in principle. We think that large companies should be transparent about it. My own council, for example, is committed to it. But I think you can't confuse the minimum wage with the living wage. One is a legal requirement. The other is an aspiration to recognise that that's the sort of money people in full-time work would hope to have a living wage. And people should be encouraged to pay it. I think the Labour Party's ideas are worth looking at, but you shouldn't confuse the two. But you know, the problem is...
But there was a lot of reaction against the minimum wage at the time.
There are some jobs that won't happen. Some small businesses will say, we can't afford to employ people at that level. Some big businesses, on the other hand, are exploiting the existing situation and paying low wages because they know the taxpayer will top it up. We need to tackle that.
It is, you know, I do think that particularly her committee must be aware of the painful decisions the government is taking to tackle the benefits bill as it is.
It's interesting that you would still want the taxpayer to fund the benefits.
Two-thirds of the families and the children living in poverty have an adult in work. That's not right, and we need to do something about it. The best thing to do is introduce the living wage. That, in a single policy decision, can actually make sure that people who are in work actually are lifted out of poverty.
But it's not the same thing as the minimum wage. It's important not to confuse the two.
Let's leave it there. Now, there's one thing that all our three guests have in common. Well, apart from all being huge fans of the Daily Politics, of course, who writes these scripts. They also all chair parliamentary select committees committees. It's an increasingly high-profile role, as we were hearing about earlier in the programme, and in a moment we'll discuss the job. But first, let's remind ourselves of some recent Select Committee moments.
I don't think we can give an apology at the moment.
Well, I suggest that you can give an apology for spinning a yarn to the press that afternoon to get someone out of high public office, because that's clearly what you were motivated to do.
I'll disagree with that, sir. That is not what we were motivated to do.
You're a company that says you do no evil, and I think you do evil in that you use smokes and mirrors.
I don't think it's a matter of...
tax.
But I think tax is not a matter of choice. Tax is a matter of following the laws that are there internationally.
But how can these profits be fair when people cannot afford to pay for their energy?
Because the...
Mr Murdoch, do you accept that ultimately you are responsible for this whole fiasco?
No.
Mr Murdoch, at what point did you find out that criminality was endemic at News of the World?
I think the committee will note that you've had to apologise for the committee since the last meeting, given that you claim not to have seen a document which you substantially, I believe, authored. So, I think
to draw an inference
we need to take your evidence with a little bit
clarification,
of a pinch of salt.
I think that's grossly unfair.
Feisty stuff. So, let's get the thoughts of our Select Committee chairs. Let's put you three under the spotlight then. Malcolm, Bruce, how come they've improved so much in profile? That's sort of the reputation of the dusty old Select Committees being pulled out. It all seems to have gone.
I think all select committees have a different job to do. It depends on the department, it depends on the circumstances. We're not there to entertain, but we are there to hold people to account, and we are also to inform the public.
Are you doing it better?
Well, I think we are. First of all, we're elected now. I think that's quite important. It's not just placed people, fixed there by the whips. People go there because they want to be there. They've got something to bring to the table. And I think that makes us much more effective and beyond the reach of government. So it makes us more independent. And I think that, has added a lot to our strength and indeed the impact of what we do.
Does it result in any real change, though?
Yes, I think the right reforms in the last Parliament, which have been introduced this Parliament, give us not more powers and therefore a more prominent national platform. We have the powers now to amend legislation as a select committee. So actually in doing pre-scrutiny, you get a pretty detailed idea of that. I have to say, as a member of a coalition, the prominent coalition party, it can be quite uncomfortable sometimes in scrutinising a department, which is so important to my own constituency, to try and help them to get the policy right.
Does that mean you're reluctant to ask those tough questions?
No, you have to be completely impartial, and that's why you're there and play the role of a candid friend. But I think the difference this Parliament is not just the fact that we're paid, which is very nice, but the fact that we have these additional powers through the right reforms, which the government have accepted and enforced.
Well, and let's take that the issue that Anne brings up. Do you think it's easier to be a member or a chair of a select committee if you're not the party in power?
I don't know, because I've never been in that situation. And but of course the majority on the committee is from the government party. But I say to them, and it's the position I took as a backbencher on the select committee, is I want my government to get it right. And if there's something the select committee can illustrate or point to that could be a disaster in the making, sensible governments and sensible departments will listen, I hope, to some of the things that we're saying.
But do MPs grandstand? I mean, do you have to watch? Do you have to watch if some of your committee members start sort of taking over and become a bit of a celebrity themselves?
I think it is sometimes worrying if you have a high-profile witness like the Secretary of State that they might be exposed. But I think really we now have the opportunity to really hold the government to account.
It does irritate other members of the
committee. I think
too.
you do actually notice that. You forget to notice that the cameras are there, but I think the strength is that we are cross-party, and if you can reach cross-party, so it's across the piece, and we reach decisions by consensus.
And the most effective select committees are the ones who are able to put the political differences, leave them at the door, and actually work together.
We try to avoid voting in the committee, and sometimes you absolutely have to.
You have to, and there have been some fairly high-profile cases where
work very hard. An amendment may come along, somebody says, I don't quite agree with this, and you actually negotiate it through to the point where you can agree. Also, I could say that the department very often will wait for a committee report before it finalises a policy, and quite often accepts the recommendation, because it's based on objective evidence. It's not based on the prejudice of 11 members of the committee. We brought that evidence in from outside.
Who's the best chair in the business?
It's difficult to say. I They're all our
favourites.
They're all our favourites.
They're all our favourites, as Bruce Forsyth would say. Well done. Thank you all very much, and thank you for being our guests today on the programme. I'll be back tomorrow, of course, with all the big political stories of the day.